I'm Lee Moore,
I'm Rob Moore.
and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Rob, today we're looking at another Pu Songling story,
Yet another.
and another one about something that's painted.
Yep. There's a lot of paint in Pu Songling, oddly enough.
Yeah, he's very interested in this kind of, this I would say, a Proustian kind of world where different kinds of art mix.
Right. In a world in which, in a very, depending on your view on aesthetics, a classic presentation of art being able to take you to a different world than the one you're in. In this case, literally. So the story we're looking at is called The Painted Wall. We have another podcast here on the painted skin. This is a painted wall. I'm going to break it down super quick and then we can get into it. Two guys go to a Buddhist... hang on. Buddhist or Taoist?
It's Buddhist. Yeah, it's Zen master.
Two guys go to visit a Zen master, and the Zen master's showing off the grounds, and they find some paintings of fairy spirits. And one of the guys is deeply attracted to one of the spirits in the painting and suddenly finds himself in the painting with that particularly fairy spirit. And of course, because it's a Pu Songling story, what happens next? They sleep together. Of course they do. And continue sleeping together for some time. But eventually, word gets around that there's a person from the not painting world in the painting world, and a guard, overseer, lawkeeper of some kind shows up with chains at the door of the abode where the two are together. Says, "Hey, is there somebody in there?" The woman has hidden the guy under the bed, and she has fled. There's silence. So the guy comes in, looks around, doesn't see anyone because he doesn't think to check under the bed. He's a pretty awesome guard. He leaves. The guy's terrified. The Zen priest on the other side of the painting says to the painting, "Hey, what are you doing in there? Why are you in there so long? Your friend's waiting for you." And the guy, blam, manifests back in the real world. And his friend is thunderstruck. "Hey, where have you been?" The guy tells him the story. End of story.
In other words, this is the ancient Chinese version of Aha's video Take On Me.
Wow, dude. Good pop culture reference.
Right?
It actually is, though. Yeah, you're
It's
right.
pretty much the same thing.
Well, you know what's funny? One of the things I find fascinating about a lot of these stories of the fantastic is how common a lot of these elements are. Like, yeah, it's the Aha video. It's also every painting in the Harry Potter series, right?
That's true, yeah.
It's also a painting in C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. One of the characters in Voyage of the Dawn Treader falls into a real painting. There's the portrait of Dorian Gray. There's over and over, there's paintings being not paintings.
Right. And I think one of the reasons for that is that talking about paintings, and I mentioned Proust at the very beginning, and I think this is what Proust is getting at, talking about a literary work about a painting is actually a way to get about talking about literature and the value of literature and all art in a very roundabout way so that it doesn't feel like you're talking about literature. It's not like the professor is up at the front of the classroom lecturing, this is what literature is, this is aesthetics. This is a much more fun, kind of playful way to get at the kinds of feelings we can feel when we experience art. We can really fall in love with a character as the hero in the story does.
And I would argue that it's a common among most cultures that have any sort of visual culture that there is a way of capturing or presenting reality where you feel like you're there somehow. So it's not too much of a jump to just present, well, what if you were there, right? This is a common argument, this ideal reality argument. In the late 19th century, early 20th century, you have someone like Liang Qichao, who's trying to reform literature at the time, arguing that one of the powers of fiction is its ability to present an ideal world, one that's not this world. Like, it might have a lot of the same rules and stuff, but the rules which the reader can control, can imagine, can do a lot of different things with. And this story is along those same lines, right? It's a fairly commonplace setting. I would think at the time a lot of the people reading this would have been to monasteries of one kind or another and seen paintings, and probably many of them had imagined, wonder what it would be like to be marching with the emperor up Mount Tai in this picture. Well, this is it, right?
The other thing, so beyond the sort of transmedial notes on aesthetics, that the sort of Proustian idea of painting as being a commentary on literature, as being a commentary on all art. The other thing I like is the Buddhist nature of this story. So it's clearly, as I've argued, lots of Pusong Ling is, it's clearly alluding to Zhuangzi. And Zhuangzi has his butterfly dream, which we've already done a podcast on, where he goes back and forth and doesn't know whether he's really Zhuangzhou, the guy who was dreaming he was a butterfly, or if he is actually a butterfly who's now just currently dreaming that he is this guy named Zhuangzhou. So that's that kind of back and forth nature of reality. And is any of this reality really real is going on here. I also like the fact that this is a story about a Buddhist monk in some ways, and the Zen Buddhist master who's showing them around the temple is the one who kind of has the jump on knowledge. He knows where Meng Longtang's friend, the provincial graduate Zhu is the hero who goes into the painting.
ZHU, not JEW. That would be problematic.
Anyways, that's a different podcast.
Indeed.
We're not going to get into the Kaifeng Jews here.
No.
So provincial graduate Zhu is hanging out inside the painting. His friend Meng Longtang doesn't know what's going on. The Buddhist monk, he knows. And so there is this sense that whether it's the religious knowledge, I don't know, but it's that he does have a kind of enlightenment that Buddhism strives for, and it's a aesthetic, artistic enlightenment. Like that's one of the reasons I kind of question the religious nature of the story. The story is not at all religious.
No.
It's not saying, hey, Buddhism's great, because there is no point of doctrine going on in here. It's just like this guy is really, really smart, and he somehow has this knowledge that no one else in the story has access to.
Yeah, it's a different side of we have the podcast on painted skin has a Taoist priest with access to knowledge of the other world. And this is another priest who has similar knowledge, but the notion that the actual world of the fantastic is a different thing than a painting or a poem about the world of the fantastic. Those lines are not so clear in a lot of early Chinese works, right? Being able to talk about a poem or a painting authoritatively makes you already have some kind of connection to the beyond.
I'm thinking particularly of Tao Yuanming's story of the
peach blossom.
Tao Yuanming's story of the peach blossom spring, where the unnamed hero. Yeah. I'm thinking particularly of Tao Yuanming's story of the peach blossom spring, where the hero wanders into a cave, which is actually sort of another world, and then wanders out. That seems to be part of what's going on here and what Pusong Ling is alluding to.
Right, but here what's different, though, is that guy sort of wanders in. This Zen priest, Zen figure, anyway, knows. He knows ahead of time what's going on.
And also, one thing that's interesting about this story, The Painted Wall, is that there is a clear dividing line in between this world and the world of the painting, and we recognize it, but Pusong Ling is arguing that it's much more penetratable than we think of normally.
Which, and to bring it back to Liang Qichao, was a major reason why a lot of writers, a lot of figures, period, in the late 19th, early 20th centuries who were looking to sort of reform and change Chinese society were looking to fiction and stories, because they realized that for tons of people, a good story makes that dividing line between what is possible and what is actual very thin. You could transport people in such a way that, there were already sequels upon sequels upon sequels to some of the more famous Chinese literary works by the time these guys were writing, late 19th century. So it's not unreasonable to think, if you can convince people they can hide inside a painting, why not channel that? Because Liang Qichao in particular is saying, that's not a good thing. People should want to be in the real world, right? But what if we were able to channel that sort of power into, getting people to think more about like science and stuff like that? It didn't really work quite that way, because later on he was like, yeah, it all pretty much sucks.
One final thought I had is about what this says about how China is developing in terms of socioeconomics. So, whereas in the Tao Yunming story, which is being written in probably the first couple of centuries of the Common Era, so maybe 300 or 400 CE, this story is being written in the very early Qing. So we're talking about after 1644, Pu Songling is collecting these stories and he publishes them in this collection called the Liao Jai Zhi, the stories of
Strange Tales from Chinese Studio, from Liao Studio.
Strange Tales from Liao Jai. It's normally, we call it just Liao Jai. So this collection of stories is being published at a time when China is on the cusp of going downhill in terms of its place geopolitically. But at this point, it's still some of the areas in China, like the lower Yangtze River Valley, they're still some of the richest areas in the world economically. And you have this story, which I believe occurs in the province of Jiangxi, which is in the south, a fairly mountainous, but in some areas fairly prosperous area. And Rob, you were saying it's easy to imagine someone traveling to a monastery and seeing this kind of painting, and this is probably something that's fairly common. I just want to point out that it's only fairly recently that it would have been very common. And that commonness enables Pu Songling to write this kind of story, to take the common and make it uncommon. But before about 1500, travel within China was much more limited, and there was much less wealth to produce these kind of artistic works like painting and particularly religious painting. So although there definitely was that before, this, I think you're right, this has become very common by this point, but its commonness, its very everydayness, its quotidianness is necessary for the story to work. You have to see paintings fairly frequently for to have someone go, oh, actually that painting is it's penetratable.
Well, and we could almost stop using the word common and sort of just say widespread, because there are a lot of technologies, for example, now that are widespread that everyone has access to, but that are still the subject of numerous fantasies and science fiction works, right? Because we all have them, but it's still pretty phenomenal when we use them and think about them, tablets, smartphones, things like that. And so in this era, having sort of a new widespread access to painting, to art, even if you've already seen this stuff, it's still new enough that it's a subject of fantasy in its own right. It doesn't take a genius to turn it into something like this. Everyone's already going, wow, I've seen it before, but that's really amazing that we can see this, right?
Yeah. Though Pu Songling is a genius. I think
absolutely. I agree. I'm just saying you don't have to be a genius. It helps, certainly.
I think that's a good place to end it, just on Pu Songling's genius.
Just, if again, we don't usually do this, but if you have enjoyed the podcast or any of the podcasts, for example, give us a review on iTunes or one of the platforms you use. That's how we tend to sort of get people who've never heard the podcast in on the podcast. So we would appreciate it.
If you're interested in this work, The Painted Wall by Pu Songling, we use John Minford's translation. There are other translations, but this one's a pretty decent one.
John Minford's a good translator, yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right, I'm Lee Moore.
I'm Rob Moore.
And this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.